Hi and welcome. It's kind of intimidating having a countdown. I'm so happy to see all of you here and see this many people in a room. They're so excited about sharing their family stories and about family history in general. It's just a thrill to be here. I'm Allison Taylor. My husband Tom Taylor and I have a company called Pictures and Stories. And for the last 10 years, we have had the wonderful privilege of being able to help people, our clients, put their life stories and their family stories into beautiful coffee table books. And we absolutely love every day of what we do. So we're here to help get you excited about telling your stories and to give you some ideas for ways that will make it easier. Because it's an overwhelming, it can be a totally overwhelming process. So we're going to talk about some ways that will make it easier for you to get this done. First of all, I want to talk about why we need to record our own stories for our posterity. And I know a lot of you already understand why, or you wouldn't be sitting here in this room. But I still think it's worth talking about some of these things. Because each one of you is unique. You have a unique story to share that nobody else, you've had experiences, you've had wisdom that no one else on the planet will ever be able to share with someone the way that you could. So it's important for not just for your descendants, but for all of us, for the world as a whole, for our stories to be told and preserved and shared, and so we can all learn from each other. One thing that we hear a lot in our business, and this always makes me a little bit sad when I hear people say this, but people say, oh, nobody would be interested in my stories. I've had a really boring life. Let me tell you, I can testify to you that nobody has a boring life. Everybody has an interesting story to tell. It's just a matter of finding those stories, figuring out what the most important stories are, and how that can be of value to someone else. This lovely lady in the left two pictures here, her name is Marguerite Hicken. We started working with her on her book when she was 104 years old. She was sharp as a tack, remembered everything. And she entitled her book, I May Be Old Someday. And Maggie did not have a posterity of her own children. She was never able to have children. So she didn't have children and grandchildren to pass this on to. But she had a wide variety of friends and had a lot of people in the community who were very, very interested in her story. She grew up in Germany during World War I. She still has memories of World War I. Has an incredible story to tell. And her words to me were, you know, I don't think my life is really that interesting, which I can tell you, it was fascinating. She said, I don't think my life is that interesting, but I enjoy reading other people's stories. So maybe somebody would be interested in some of my stories. And they absolutely were. The woman on the right is my 6th great grandmother, Alice Crawford Armstrong, who I'm sort of almost named after. This is her right here. I created this. This was a drawing that was done of her in like 1820, I think. And when she was an older woman. And I did this, I put this together we were doing a youth family history thing in our ward. And so I made this and told this story about her. And the youth immediately dubbed her Alice on a Stick. So, so this is my beloved Alice on a Stick. Alice is my cheerleader. And I'm here to tell you that you have no idea how one simple story from your life could change someone's life 250 years from now, because it happened to me. When I found one story, the one surviving story from this woman's life, in an obscure history book in the family history library, I stumbled on this story. I was going through a very difficult time in my life. I had just gone through a divorce. I had been a stay-at-home mom, didn't know how I was going to feed my child, how I was going to get through life. I was at a very low point when I found this story about my 6th great grandmother, Alice, who was one of the original colonial pioneers in western Pennsylvania. They lived in a log cabin. They had very few people around them. And her husband had gone off to do something, hunting, I'm not sure what it was, but had left for the winter. And she was home taking care of her children in the wilds of western Pennsylvania, not another soul around. And they didn't know how they were going to get through the winter. Alice looked out the window one day and spied a deer that had slipped on the frozen pond outside of her house. She grabbed a knife, she ran across the pond, and got this deer and was able to have meat to feed her family for I mean, she did this all by herself, skinned the deer, and then made beautiful kidskin gloves out of the hide that she sent back to her more civilized family back in the East Coast. And so I read this story, and this story gave me the strength that I needed to keep going in my own life. And I thought, oh my gosh, this woman in her way was going through the same kind of a challenge that I was having in my life, and she got through it. And I could feel her spirit. I could feel her with me, championing me, getting me through the situation that I was in. This woman literally changed my life, changed the trajectory that I was on, and gave me hope. And I have felt her kind of being my cheerleader ever since. So I'm here to tell you that it is possible that one story from your life could make a huge, huge difference to somebody else. One thing to ask yourself, if you're still sort of hesitant about, why should I spend the time to, telling any of my stories? Ask yourself, what would you like to know about your ancestors that you don't know? I mean, anybody in here wish that you knew more about your great-great-grandparents? You have nothing on them, right? It's like we all want to know more about those people who came before us. So don't you think that the people that come after you, your descendants, are going to want to know more about your life than they will probably get, unless you preserve those stories. If you do it, if you don't do it, who will? Maybe your children. Do you trust their version of your life? Something to think about. And once it gets to your grandchildren, they're not going to know that much about you. All they'll have is their memories of you. They won't know anything that happened before they were around. So it's cheaper than therapy. And I say this kind of facetiously, and yet you will find as you go through the process of looking at your life stories, collecting them, going through them, processing that, you will learn so much about yourself. It can be really, really fun, but also really educational. It's amazing what you can learn about your life and seeing your life as a whole. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Is this the legacy that you want to leave your children? Okay. We have a booth in the expo hall. It's booth number 1406 if you want to come by later. But we have a display of family history stuff. And as everybody's walked by there today and said, how did you get all this stuff out of my basement? This looks exactly what's in my room. So ask yourself, if this is what you hand down to your children, how are they going to be able to make sense of that? And eventually it's just going to get pitched. And there are some nuggets of gold in there that could be lost forever. Okay? Or do you want to pick out what's important, what's most essential out of that, and leave them with something that can be enjoyed and appreciated and cherished and handed down through generations? It's totally up to you. If you boil down the essentials of your life and really find what's most important, it will be that much more special to those people who you give it to. There are so many ways now to make this process easier on yourself, okay? We all know the old school model of doing a personal history, all right? You wait until you're retired, maybe even later, 80, 85, you've lived a good part of your life, and you say, okay, I'm finally going to write my life story. And you start with, I was born, and you go through up to the present day, and you end up with a book that's this thick, that's all text, put it in a binder, or you send it to the family history library, and everybody goes, oh, thanks, Grandma, this is so great. And they put it on a shelf. And then it ends up in a box in the basement, okay? You don't have to do it that way. It doesn't have to be complete, comprehensive, chronological of your whole life. You can break it into smaller pieces, do it in smaller projects, and we'll talk a lot more about this as we go along. You can do a life highlights book. Just pick out a few of your most important stories so you have a totality of your life, the scope of your life, but not everything, just what's most important to you. You can do a book on a particular theme. We've done quite a few books for clients that have kind of a spiritual theme where they will just pick out a few really important spiritual experiences in their life and do a book on that. You might do a book about a battle with a serious illness and how you came through that, what you learned from that. You could do a shorter scope of time, like your experiences in the military or on a mission or when you were a child. I just did a short book for my daughter, about 30 pages long. She asked me, what was it like growing up in the 60s? And so I wrote this little book and just told some of the stories of my childhood and what it was like, and I included some pictures of some things from the 60s and 70s. And she really enjoyed it, and it didn't take me that long to do. So looking at chapters of your life, you can do a series of short books, one about your childhood, maybe one about your college and young adult experiences. You don't have to put it all in one big volume. So the question then is, how do I get to what are my best stories? So that's mostly what we're going to talk about today. Okay, first of all, let's talk a little bit about what a story actually is. So these are kind of the classic elements of what is involved in a story. Okay, you have the setting of the story, which is the where and when, when it took place, where you were. The characters are the people in your story. Sometimes they could be animals too. The theme is, what is the point of the story? What is this story about? Is it a love story? Is it a fish out of water story? Is it an adventure story? Could be any number of those things. The plot is the general sequence of events, what happens after what. And then every good story has some kind of problem or struggle that the protagonist, which is usually you if you're writing about your own life, it doesn't necessarily have to be, but something that you have overcome, something that you learned, something that you had to get through. And it doesn't mean that that story has to be long or it has to be a sad or tragic or epic story. Even a short story can have a struggle in it. Tom Sawyer, for instance, his struggle was that he didn't want to paint the fence. So he had to figure out a way to get someone else to do it for him. That was Tom Sawyer's struggle. So it can also be comic. There's a difference between a story and a report. This is a great example that I found on the old Family Search website, and I hope this is still in there somewhere. It's probably on their wiki, I'm sure, still. But this sort of shows the difference between what a report is and what a story is. A report is just the facts, ma'am, okay? We've got, I, Lindsay Mary Adams, was born on March 31st, 1951 in London, England, okay? That's how a lot of personal histories start off that way. It's important genealogical information. We want to have it in there. It's also a little dry, okay? So here's a way that this author was able to get all that information, the genealogical information across in a way that's much more entertaining and turning it into a story. My mother really didn't want me to be born on April Fool's Day, so she convinced her doctor to induce her labor in the morning of March 31st. Things have changed a lot since 1951, but in those days it was almost unheard of in London, England, for a birth to be induced for the mother's convenience. The young Scottish doctor was willing to be innovative, and I was born 3 hours before April Fool's Day. The doctor was given the privilege of choosing my name, possibly as part of the inducement deal, and I was given the good Scottish name of Lindsay Mary to go along with my family name, Adams. So you have this paragraph-long, cute, humorous little story that has all the genealogical information in there, but it's also entertaining. It's got all the basic plot elements are there. It's got the setting. You got the characters are the mother and the doctor and even the baby. And the theme of the story is mother always gets what she wants. Okay? And I'm sure there's probably more stories about the mother in the rest of this history. There's a difference between a story and an anecdote. An anecdote is one of those things that you tell, you're sitting around with your friends at dinner and you're talking about, okay, what was your most embarrassing moment, okay? For me, my anecdote, and I've told this, hundreds of times since I was young, yeah, it was the time that I was in the junior high school play and I had a wardrobe malfunction. And in front of the entire junior high school, my skirt fell off and I was standing there in my underwear on the stage. That is a true story. But it's not a story, it's just an anecdote, okay? It's just a funny kind of thing that you tell, yeah, this funny thing happened to me, okay? Now, a funny thing happened. As I was writing stories about my own life, and I was looking at connections in my life of what else was going on in my life at that time. And I realized it wasn't just a funny anecdote. That was a huge turning point in my life, and I didn't even realize it until I sat down and started looking at my life as a whole and what else was going on at the time, and I realized, oh my gosh, this was a pivotal moment in my life. So the deeper meaning behind the story is, as I was in this play, we were doing The Miracle Worker, if any of you are familiar with that, and I was playing Anne Sullivan. And there's a scene in the play where she and Helen Keller are fighting over over lunch, and she's trying to get her to eat with a knife and fork. Okay, so we're having this big like food fight wrestling scene, and my skirt falls off in the middle. I'm standing there in my underwear, and the whole junior high is just like erupting and woo, you know. And as I was standing there, I had this epiphany. You know, you have those moments where time just stops, and you just like, what do I do now? And what I wanted to do was just run off the stage in tears, because a lot of those people in that audience were people who had just tortured me all through junior high school. But something happened to me. It's like in that moment of clarity, as I'm standing there, you know, half naked on stage in my underwear, I realized, wait a minute, I don't want you know, I'm not going to let these people get the best of me. And I got mad. So I put all of my anger and all of that pent-up frustration from being bullied by these kids into the scene. I grabbed Helen, wrestled her to the ground, pulled up my skirt, and finished the scene, and the whole audience just went quiet. And we finished the play, you know, thunderous applause, and the next morning, all these kids kept coming up to me in the hall, kids that had never spoken to me before, and they, wow, you were really good in the play. And nobody ever bullied me again at that junior high. So the important part of the story, and I don't mean to bore you with my stories, because you have your own stories that are so much more interesting than that. But the point is that when I looked deeper at that anecdote, that funny anecdote, I realized that was a turning point in my life, where I finally suddenly found a power within myself that I didn't know I had, and I found something that I was good at and that I could do well. And I went on to do more theater and other stuff that way, and gained a lot of confidence from those experiences. So look at the deeper meaning of some of those, you know, those stories that you tell over and over at Thanksgiving every year, and see if there's a deeper meaning there, because that might be something that's really important in your life. So what is the point of the story that you want to tell? Does it have a point? If it doesn't have a point, there may be better stories to include in your history if you're trying to pare it down. Is it humorous or entertaining? And sometimes that's enough. If you just have a really funny story, sometimes that's all it needs to be there. Does it reveal a character, either your own or somebody in your family, somebody that you know? Does it teach a lesson to someone who might be reading it? What did you learn? How did that experience change you? What did you learn from it? And you don't have to spell out the point when you're writing the story. Usually the point is self-evident. You don't have to point to it and say, oh, this is what this story is about. It will usually tell itself. So going back to how you find what your best stories are, we always tell all of our clients to start with a life timeline of some sort. It's a great starting place, because you need to have a single place where you can capture all of these random ideas as they come to you. And you'll find as you start this process, it triggers off memories in your brain, and the more you think about these things, the more memories that will come to you. So you can use a big chart. You can get yourself a big long piece of paper and write years on the top. You can use a notebook with a year. You can use, I put a lot of my memories as they come to me, I put them into Evernote. If anybody uses Evernote or some other sort of note-taking software, that's a great way to do it. Excel spreadsheet, whatever works for you. But if you have one central place that you can just grab these stories as they come to you, because otherwise they come and then they go again, and they may not be back. So you want to be sure and capture them. Then after you've spent some time, and this is always an ongoing process because you're always going to keep remembering things, but at some point you look at all these things, you go over your timeline and all these story ideas that you've collected, and you say, what cannot be left out of my story? Okay? What is the most important thing? If I were going to die tomorrow, what is the most important thing I want my family to know about me? And start there, okay? And then you go on to the next most important thing. And so you can actually go through and just figure out, you know, what's really the most essential. This is an exercise, and you don't have to write all these down, because I just posted this on our blog this morning. So if you go to picturesandstories.com, we have a blog on there. There's no ads or anything. It's just educational. And I posted this list on there. So if you want, it's on there. You can look at it, and it has this whole exercise on here. But this is a really good exercise to do, to just really quickly, without overthinking it, just quickly write down the 10 funniest things that have ever happened to you, the most tragic things, the most influential people and such, and you just go through and just kind of brainstorm and remember as many of these things as you can. And then you look for connections. Do any of these things show up on more than one list? okay? And when it comes down to my little story in junior high, it was on my list of funniest things that happened to me. It was on my list of turning points, epiphanies, and most embarrassing moments. That's a, you know, that's a pretty pivotal story in my life. So that's a good way to kind of see, you know, gauge what's really important. Then as you go through and you're choosing these stories, you ask yourself, you know, is this story good enough to include? So does it fit the purpose? And this is something that we usually we have our clients start with, is making a purpose statement. What do you want to accomplish by writing this story? Who is your audience? Who are you doing this for? And what type, you know, scope or theme or time period are you working with? And does it fit those things? You may be working on a book about your childhood, and you suddenly remember this great story of something that happened when you were a teenager, or, you know, later in your life, and you want to keep that story because you might want to use it for a different project, but it might not fit into this project. Does it have a point? Is it really important enough to include? As I said before, if you knew you were going to die tomorrow, what would you want people to know? And ask your audience. Just like my daughter said to me, hey Mom, what was this like? So my answer was to write this little book for her. So ask them, what do you want to know about my life? And that might be a good place to start. We could do a whole hour on dealing with family skeletons. Unpleasant things that have happened to you, the really tough stuff in life. And this is something that all of our clients struggle with. Every one of you will struggle with this in writing your life stories. What should I include? What do I leave out? Is this going to hurt someone? How do I say this without, you know, causing a big ruckus in the family? There are a lot of considerations for that, and that's a topic for another day. But just some things, just really quickly. First of all, ask yourself, is this really your story to tell? We did a wonderful book for a man who had been a bishop and a stake president, and he had a wonderful sense of humor. He was just a hilarious guy. But he loved to tell funny stories about other people that he knew, his neighbors and people that, you know, and at some point we just had to say, okay, what does this say about your life? Is this really a part of your life? No, it's just a funny story. Well, then maybe it doesn't belong in your book. You can leave it, you know, sister so-and-so can put it in her book. So if it's a story that may hurt someone else, or might end, you know, you don't want to get sued, you know, you have to be careful, then you want to look at those stories. You can use assumed names. You know, change the details somewhat. If it's a story that's important to tell, but you want to protect someone else's privacy. Really examine your motivations. Why are you telling this story, especially if it's a hard one to tell? Are you really trying to express something meaningful? Or are you just trying to get even? Or are you know, bitter grapes? Just really look at your motivations and say, why do I want to tell this story? And also make sure that this is your truth and your version of the story. This happens to every single one of you as you do this. Your sister's going to read your manuscript and she's going to say, that is totally not how it happened. That is not what happened. If she wants to write her version of the story, she can go write her own version of the story. You write your version, and don't let your children or your siblings or your friend who wants to be a writer and is jealous of you, any of those people, don't let them derail you. You tell the story that, from your point of view, that is important to you. My husband's father was a Navy airline pilot in World War II, and he built airplanes. He was a pilot all his life. And he used to say that, you know, what you need in aerodynamics to be able to fly, you need more lift than drag. So that's a good way to think about your stories. Does this story, even if it's a difficult or a negative or a tough experience in your life, is there some lift to it? Is there some reason for telling it that can uplift someone and not drag them down? Does it have more lift than drag? Okay, so I put this scary lady in here because this is the part that scares most of us the most, is actually getting the writing done. It scares me the most, and I spend about half of my time writing other people's stories for a living, and writing is still scary. It's hard work. So here are some ways that will make it much easier for you, I promise. Okay, first of all, don't start at the beginning. That is the hardest way to write a history of your life, is to start with, I was born at this time and this happened, and write your stories chronologically up until the present time. Most people make it, maybe if they're lucky, halfway through the first grade before they get totally burned out and they're just done. Because you're starting with the hardest part. First of all, it's the hardest part to remember because you weren't there or you were too young to remember, so it requires research. Even, you know, and if you're starting with your parents' history instead of your own, that gets even exponentially harder. And it doesn't mean that you don't want to include those things. You just don't want to start there. You don't want to start writing there. So I always tell people to start with the low-hanging fruit. Look at your list of stories, the ones that you've circled that are the most important. Look at it and find the easiest one to tell. Either the one that seems like to be the most fun, or the one that was the easiest or that you recall the most, and start there and just start working on that story. And then just continue in a completely random order until you have a little string of separate stories. And then you can put them together later. Don't try to write something chronologically. If writing really isn't your thing, if you don't like to write or it intimidates you or that's the part that you're getting hung up with, there are all kinds of other ways to do it. You can do wonderful oral histories, and there are so many ways now to go and record your histories for free. You can go to the Family History Library, the Riverton Library. There's all kinds of places online where you can record your stories, and then you can get a transcription of that. You can do some editing, and you have the narrative for a book. You can use Dragon Dictation. We'll talk about that a little bit later. When you get to the point of writing your stories, you can rather than just starting and jumping in, let's say you've taken a story off of your timeline, okay? You don't want to just jump in and start writing that story. Write yourself some notes first. Okay, just you can do it on an index card or a piece of paper and just write down as many things, many details, plot points as you can remember about that particular story. See if there's any other little random bits of non-story material like genealogical information or descriptions of what somebody looked like or the house that you were born, and see if you can weave those in to the stories that you want to tell. Just capture those details, and then you have this nice, neat little card to remind you of all these things before you actually start writing it, and that will help you a great deal. When you're in the process of writing a story, after you write your first story, write it, put it aside, don't look at it again for a while, okay? Because if you try to go back and edit and constantly rework the same story over and over and over until it's perfect, you will never get to the second story, okay? So what I tell people is just write that story as quickly as you can, put it in a drawer. Then pick another story. Write that story, write the first draft as quickly as you can, put it away until you've gone through all those stories that you want to tell on your list. Then you will go back and edit it later. You'll get a much better sense of kind of what you have. You'll have some time and some space, and then you can take a fresh look at it. Don't listen to all the voices in your head telling you that you're not a good writer. Your AP teacher, English teacher from high school, don't worry about the grammar. Don't worry about who's going to be reading it. And write whatever you feel like writing. If it's something that's sensitive and you feel like you just need to get the whole story out and you know that you're going to have to take some of it out to not offend people later, you can do that later. Go ahead and write what you need to write. You can always back it off and take things out at a later point. And just remember that the first draft is just for you. So write whatever you want in there. Later on, if you have some people that you trust, that you want to help you look at it later and give you some feedback, you can do that. But this first one, it's just for your eyes only. So once you start writing your stories, how do you make those stories interesting for your reader? Okay, you don't want to bore people who are reading your stories. So here's some things to keep in mind that will spice up your stories and make them a little more interesting. First of all, a great story is moved forward by intrigue. If you're keeping your audience guessing as to what happens next, oh my gosh, she's standing on the stage in her underwear, what is she going to do now? Okay, those kinds of details are the things that will keep people engaged in your story. One of the absolute favorite books I've ever had the privilege to work on was from, she was a housewife from Nephi. She was 89 years old, and she sat down at her computer and she typed out on her life story in all caps so that she could read them with her eyes. And when I was putting that book together with her pictures, every morning I got up and I could not wait to know what happened next in her life. I was just like dying for the next installation of the story. It was absolutely fascinating. Find the emotion in the story. Okay, again, going from that simple, funny anecdote to, what's really the deeper meaning of this? All that emotion that was going on behind it. That's what people can relate to, because finding those emotions, that is the universal part of your story. Because all of us feel sad, and all of us are embarrassed, and all of us have experiences where we share the same emotion, and that's our common ground as human beings. And if you can tap into that and get that emotion across, sorry, that's my phone going off. If you can get those emotions across in a way that other people can relate to, even if it's a completely different story and a completely different scenario, that something is happening in their life, like maybe your grandchild who's reading it, they can still say, oh yeah, I had something really embarrassing that happened to me too just last week, and here's how grandma got through it. Maybe, that can help them too. So just look for those moments, and also look for where does this story go? What struggle or conflict, as we talked about before, have you overcome? What did you learn? What was your point A? And where were you at the beginning of the story? And where were you, or who were you at the end of the story? Find out that trajectory, because that will pull the reader with you, and they'll want to know what happened next. Writing that's specific is much more interesting than writing that is very general, okay? For instance, you can say, my father was a very frugal man. Okay, everybody knows what the word frugal means, you kind of understand what that means. But if you can draw a picture for your readers, how much more interesting for them will that be? You can say, my father kept every rubber band that came into the house in an old coffee can. He washed and reused aluminum foil, each square carefully folded and tucked away in the special aluminum foil drawer. Okay, so you have this, can't you see the picture? You can see the coffee can with the rubber bands. You can see what this looks like, and it gives the reader something to visualize. Including detail is always a good thing, but you also want to make sure that you're giving interesting details and not just dry, boring details. And sometimes it's kind of hard to figure out, which ones are interesting and which ones aren't. The interesting ones are usually things that reveal character, or things that reveal some sort of emotion, or that relate to that struggle that the person's going through. Not always. Sometimes it's great to just have, rich description of something that is pleasing to read and doesn't necessarily have, a lot of deep meaning to it. But you want to make sure that the details that you include add life to the story and don't drag it down. And this is kind of a long example, so I hope I don't bore you with this. But on the right is an example of, and this is someone that actually came from a story that we were helping somebody work with. And he was a very literal person, accountant, and liked to kind of keep this in order. And so he talked about buying this new house. He talked about the asking price for the house, and what they were able to get it for, how many bedrooms it has, how many days it took them to pack the house, how many boxes, how many bathrooms. They finished the basement. It's kind of boring a little bit, don't you think? On the left is an example of also a description of a home that this family moved into, and see how much richer this is. We relished the spaciousness of our new home, an attractive 2-story brick house with shutters and a white trimmed porch. So you can kind of see what the house looks like, right? Shaded by fragrant linden trees, it faced a small concrete cul-de-sac, which quickly became a private speedway for our tricycles and doll buggies. Mother could observe our activities from her second-story sewing room, throwing open the dormer window that in later years became Juliet's balcony and the deck of the Pequod. Okay, so this is also a description of a home, and yet it says a lot about the occupants that lived there. It talks about, what the mother was like, that she watched over her children, that the children had active imaginations and were able to play outside. There's a lot of story going on in this description, and it's not just, it was this and then this and then this and then this. So again, going through that process of actually writing your stories, okay, again, you're going to write pick the lowest hanging story, the lowest hanging fruit on the tree, whatever's easiest and most fun for you to tell. Pick that first, write about that. Don't criticize yourself, don't edit it, write it, put it away. You can come back to it later, okay? And you just keep repeating this step over and over until you've gotten all those most important stories off of your timeline. And some people do this in a short period of time. We knew there was one man who decided, he said, okay, this year I'm going to write this book about my life. And so he spent just a couple of times a week, every day on his lunch hour, he'd take a legal pad and a pencil and he'd go sit outside of his office and he would write another story. And he just did that a couple of times a week for about a year and had a whole stack of stories, and it made a wonderful, beautiful book. We had another client who took 10 years to do the same thing. Every once in a while he'd get an idea for a story, he would just write it down, he'd put it away, and in 10 years he had this wealth of these wonderful, humorous, hilarious stories. We helped him put them together into a book. And he had his, I think, 80th birthday party. And they did, at the family birthday party, they made the book into a party game. They had a quiz game for all of the grandkids, and they would take questions out of the book about grandma or grandpa and ask them questions, and they had a contest to see how many people knew these funny stories about grandpa's life. It was a great way for these kids to learn about their grandpa. So you just keep going until you have this stack of stories, and just remember, nobody else has to see these at this point, so don't worry about what anybody else is going to think about this. Then you're going to look at the totality of these stories that you've written at some point, and it doesn't have to be you don't have to get to a point where you're done. You can start this whenever you feel like, okay, I've got enough that I can start working with. You just put them all out in front of you and look at it and just say, okay, now what's a kind of a logical way to put these stories together? Do I want to stick with a chronological format, which is what, you know, majority of people do, and it makes sense, and there's nothing wrong with giving a chronological account of your life. Just don't try to write it chronologically. Do you want to start, you know, a lot of people might want to start with a really dramatic incident in their life and start the story there because it pulls the reader in, it gets them really interested about the story. And then you can flash back to a different, maybe an early time in your life, and then bring the story forward up into the point of your first dramatic story. That's also a very popular device. You can write stories in a theme. Sometimes we just have a random collection of stories that don't follow a chronological fashion, maybe grouped together by themes. We did a book for a family that had, they sold their family farm up in Heber, and it was going to be turned into a golf course and housing development. And so they wanted to preserve these wonderful stories of generations of growing up on this family farm. And so we actually took all these stories from all the different siblings and members of the family, and we grouped them together by theme. There was one little section on farm animals, and everybody in the story had a funny story or a touching story about one of the animals that they worked with on the farm. So you can group things together thematically. If you then find an order for your stories and you kind of read through it and you go, you know, there's some pieces missing here, or this kind of feels awkward going from this story to this story, then you can look at, you know, what can I fill in between? What kind of transition could I write? What could be a good bridge to this? And when you've gone through that, suddenly, wow, you've got a first draft done. And that's an amazing accomplishment. And just so you know, the professional writers, also everybody writes a bad first draft. That is just part of the process. So then the next point you get to is editing. You know, every story has to be edited to some degree. And that's up to you how much time you want to spend on that. But if there's one thing I can tell you about the editing process, usually you're going to start off with, you know, it's kind of like sanding a piece of furniture, okay? You start with the coarse sandpaper, and then you move down, you know, through the grays until you get to the really fine polished stuff at the end. That's kind of how it goes with editing too. You're going to do several different passes along the way. The first pass you might go through and kind of take out the rough stuff. You kind of go, okay, I need to really reword this story, or, you know, somebody's going to be really upset, or maybe you know, you're just going to find some really rough things along the way, and those are the first things to smooth out. And then put it away for a while, and then maybe come back and do another pass and say, okay, is there a way I could maybe add some detail to this story, make it a little more interesting? Is there something that I need to take out, or something that I need to add? At some point, if you have somebody that you trust, that you want another pair of eyeballs to read your story when you get to the later part of the editing process. Just choose that person carefully. If you're going to trust somebody else with your stories, make sure it's somebody who will give you honest feedback, but also who won't trash your stories because they have an alternate motivation. And the best thing I can tell you about editing is that in between drafts, or especially after you finish that first draft, just put it away for a while and do something else. Because you know, you've all worked on projects where you just get so into it that you can't see it anymore. You don't know what it looks like, you don't know what it sounds like, because you're just so immersed in it and so involved. And you have a hard time with any objectivity. So if you put it away for a while and just do something completely different, when you come back to it, it'll be a whole different experience. And you will see things that you missed the first time around, and you'll be able to look at it with new eyes. The last thing about editing your stories is that at some point you have to stop editing. And that's really hard for a lot of people, especially people who have perfectionist tendencies, is that at some point you just have to say, okay, it's good enough, and let it go. So I said this morning, it's kind of like raising children, you know, you do the best you can, and at some point, okay, it's time for them to go to college now. And you didn't finish everything you wanted to do, and you didn't teach them everything you wanted to teach them, but it's time for them to be on your own, and you hope they call home once in a while. So it's kind of the same thing with your stories. You get to a point where you just say, okay, it's good enough. I just need to get it out there. Because if you search too hard for perfection, and you want to include everything, and you want it to be complete, and you want it to be perfect, and you want everywhere, sometimes it will just never get done. A lot of people will get hung up wanting something to be perfect, and having something out there that's imperfect is so much better than just having it all in your head and never actually getting it done. Okay, so just make sure that you actually just get it out there, let it go at some point to have its own life and start enriching those people around you. I'm going to leave you with one last thought, and then I will open it up for questions. We've got some time left, and I would love to hear some of your struggles and what you're dealing with, and try to answer some questions for you. Isaac Dinesen, who wrote Out of Africa, if anybody's read that, she says, to be a person is to have a story to tell. And I know that every single one of you in this audience has an amazing story that could change someone else's life, that could uplift someone, that could give them courage and hope. And you owe it to those people who come after you. You owe it to the world to put that out there and make it available for people. Whether you put it in a book, which we highly recommend. By the way, we also love our digital technology, and I think it's a great idea to have everything online and saved and shareable, but also don't neglect this part of it, because this is technology that is never going to go out of style. It's never going to become obsolete. You don't have to have any special equipment. It will always be there. 100, 200 years from now, that information will be there. So keep that in mind. If you want to come by our booth, get some ideas for your own stories, look at what we have. It's booth 1406, and you just look for a big bunch of red heart balloons. That's where our booth is. My early Valentine's present from my husband. Wasn't that nice? So anybody have any questions about any part of this process that you're, yes?
Do you have any experience of working with small groups, an ongoing reading and critiquing experience?
Okay, she's asking if we have any experience with working with small groups in reading and critiquing. That's not something that we have done. However, I've known a lot of people who have been a part of writing groups, and that can be a really great way to get feedback from other people and to have share your writing with each other. Again, you want to make sure that it's kind of a safe environment and that you have people that will uplift each other and be supportive with this story, because you're really revealing a lot of personal stuff about yourself. So you want to make sure that you're in a safe group. But I think that's an excellent way to help, and you motivate each other too. And if you have deadlines, you say this week we're going to write about this topic or whatever, and then you come back and share that on a regular basis. That's a wonderful way to do it. Yes, ma'am, in the back. Oh yes, I was going to talk more about dragon dictation. That's something that you may want to try if you want to tell your stories orally. You can either get a family member to ask you questions and record you. You can record on your own smartphone, record your stories. Dragon Dictation software, if you don't know what that is, it is a speech to text software. So you can speak into a microphone, the computer will record what you're saying, and it will give you a text file of that. Just a little warning, you have to proofread carefully your manuscript after that comes out, because if any of you, you know when you're texting someone on the phone and you get some weird things that come up that I did not type that word, I don't know where that came from. But Dragon has a way of, it's trying to interpret human speech, and sometimes there are interesting things that come out. One thing that we liked a lot is that the word lawyer, and especially with some local accents, would always be transcribed as liar. These are things that would pass a spell check. So you need to be sure and proof with human eyeballs and make sure that you've caught all of those speech transcription errors. But it can be a great way to get a start with the basic transcript of your life. Yes, ma'am. Dragon Naturally Speaking is the name of the software, and I think a lot of computers actually come with it, some version of it on the computer now. Anybody else have any questions today? Yes, sir. Yes. Okay. He's asked about using journals. Journals are a fabulous way to. If you're a journal keeper, that is so great, because you've already recorded a lot of these things that have happened in your life. So going back, especially as you're doing a life timeline, to go back through your journals and pull out nuggets and explore those things and add those to your timeline, that is a great way to do it. Some people have even taken their journals and actually transcribed the journals as a whole and published them in books. And that can also be, if you have done a lot of journaling, that can also be really interesting and valuable for somebody to have. But also you may, I wouldn't want anybody reading my journals, because there's probably a lot of stuff in there where I was just really frustrated that day, and I don't want people to get that kind of skewed vision of my life. And so, I would like to pull out things from my life that I feel are most important, rather than just, publishing my journals. But that is a viable option for you as well. So, any other questions? Yes. Yes, okay. She asked if we have people do a family history. We do family histories all the time. This is actually one that I just finished this last week, which was a fascinating story of a family in Chicago and their ancestors and their descendants. And this is a great example of how you can get a bigger picture of what's going on in an entire family, and you get a whole historical education as well. This family, this woman's grandfather descended from American slaves who were originally from Africa, and her grandmother's mother was descended from French royalty. So they've got quite a really diverse history. And it goes down through, it covers all of their ancestry and tells stories of all these different time periods and what it was like in Chicago during Prohibition. And one of her uncles was had some shady ties with the mafia. It just sort of goes through the decades and down to this man who never had much himself, but he was so concerned that his children had an education, because he knew that that would be their ticket out of ignorance and slavery. And so he worked multiple jobs and did whatever he could to make sure that his children were educated. His grandchildren, now every single one of them has multiple doctorate degrees. They're doctors and educators and lawyers, and all doing very well in life. And this man has done an incredible thing for his family. So what a great legacy to have this big, huge, entire story of a family. So if you're working on a family history project like this method that we talked about today is very it's very similar. You're going to go through a lot of the same things. If you're writing stories about your ancestors, you're going to, again, look for the emotion, look for the interesting details, look for as much as you can that will tell the story of the family as a whole. I don't think I mentioned before, in our booth we have actually written a book called, okay, is that 10? Okay, we got plenty of time, so we may get an early break today. We have written a book called How to Save Your Life One Chapter at a Time, and it basically takes the methods that we use with our custom clients, boils it down into a DIY book. So if you're interested in tackling this project yourself, you might want to check that out. We also have a lot of free information on our blog at picturesandstories.com, and we don't have any ads on our website. We don't spam. It's just all educational material there on the blog, and there's a lot of good articles there that can give you more information for absolutely free. So any other questions? It's picturesandstories.com, and the blog is right on the website. Anybody struggling with anything right now? Anybody in the process of this right now, and you're just hung up on something and you're stuck and you need some help getting out of it? Any particular struggles anybody's having right now? How about just the struggle of just getting started and finding the time to do it? That's the biggest one. Yes, sir? Oh, that was you were just saying yes, that's your struggle. Yes?
At the beginning, when you were using the examples of boring and not so boring, were those true facts, or were you just pulling those out, saying, well, you know, we lived on this lovely street and this lovely...
No, that actually came from a book that that one of our clients wrote about their life. So that both of those examples of the boring detail and the relevant detail actually came from manuscripts that we received from our clients. So one was done very well, and one was a little dry, and we had to kind of help him, you know, spice that up a little bit.
So in other words, you asked him, what did the house look like?
Exactly.
What was the location? So that, you know, you're not just putting fluff in there.
Right, yeah, you don't want to be just like making up details just to make it sound more interesting if you don't know. You know, because you still want it to be real and you want it to be authentic. But I also think that there's a technique that a lot of memoir writers use, and I think this is a valid technique as long as you disclose what you're doing. And that is if you maybe you have a little story about your grandmother, but it's not really complete. You don't have any pictures of her at that particular time when that story is happening, so you don't really know what she looked like or maybe what she wore. But you can always, you as the writer of the story, still have a voice. So even if this story that you're writing is about your grandmother, it's still also about you. And so there's validity in saying, you know, I can imagine when my grandmother, as she was walking home from school, how, you know, just how humiliating that must have been for her to have those boys chasing her. And I can see her running down the street. And, you know, so you can use your own imagination, too, to kind of fill in some of those details and say, you know, well, I wasn't there, but this might have been what it was like for her because you know, so you can weave your own imagination into it as well, as long as, you know, you're being transparent with that. Yes? Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, she's asking how much do you change grammar and speech patterns and that kind of stuff. I think that's an entirely personal choice. We usually, at a starting point with our clients, we try to keep the voice as authentic as possible. You know, most people when we're transcribing an oral interview, most people, including myself, do not speak in complete sentences. You know, everybody has finished, unfinished thoughts and start. So we try to go through and do an initial cleanup, but we pretty much, you want to be able to read the person's or your own manuscript and be able to hear that person speaking. Okay? You want to keep that voice authentic. And sometimes, you know, if someone says we was instead of we were, it's kind of up to you. I think it's charming and it's authentic to leave people's speech patterns and grammar in their original form. However, we have also had clients who, once they look at the manuscript of, you know, the cleaned up manuscript from their recorded interviews, they go, oh my goodness, I can't believe the grammar I used there, and they want us to change it. And that's okay too, it's valid. It's a personal choice. But I always think that, you know, to err on the side of authenticity is better than to try to overly correct everything, because then you start to lose the person's accent. When we did Maggie's book, she has a very pronounced German accent, and she has a certain way of phrasing, you know, phrasing sentences that is different from someone who is a native English speaker. And I didn't want to change those, because you can actually read that and you can hear it. And so her little interesting syntax and the way she puts sentences together is actually really interesting. So you want to hold on to some of that. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with Scrivener software? And if so,
Scribner software. I am not familiar with that. So has anybody had any experience with Scribner software and using that? Is it a way to transcribe oral stories? What does it do?
It's a software tool that is used by a lot of writers because it's set up so you can just capture random thoughts just exactly the way you describe it.
Okay, great.
Organize them, piece them together, flesh them out, and it seems to be a good tool, but I haven't tried it.
Yeah, okay, that's something that it would be worth looking into. It sounds like it might be very helpful for something like that. Scribner software. Okay, 5 minutes, thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
I would just like to kind of clarify the language a little bit. My father uses it.
Uh-huh. So he would say get instead of get and such. Uh-huh.
So I'm going through and as I'm transcribing this, I'm using it. And then I'm in parentheses putting the right word in. Is it necessary?
Okay, I think, again, as a personal preference, she's asking if she should put the real word in parentheses afterwards, so say get and then get in parentheses. I think as long as it's understandable what the person's trying to say, I don't think you have to spell it out each time and correct it. If you read a lot of like early church, LDS church history, for instance, you know, and the way that, you know, even Brigham Young, the way these relatively, you know, uneducated, at least as formal education, you know, their spelling was really fluid, the way they used it was kind of all over the place, and that's just kind of the way things were back then. And so a lot of historians will actually leave that speech as it is. Sometimes they'll put something in brackets. If it's something that's really hard to understand and you don't think your audience is going to understand what is meant by that, then I think you can put something in brackets after it that will clarify it for the reader, because you want them to be able to understand it. But I think if it's something that is fairly obvious, like get versus get, I think you can probably just leave it alone, and people will be able to understand what's being said pretty well. And you keep that original flavor. Any other questions? Got just a couple more quick minutes. Yes?
Just a comment that I thought of. Think of how different Star Wars would be if Yoda talked like everybody else.
Did you hear that? She said, think of how different Star Wars would be if Yoda talked like everybody else. You know, so I mean that it shows a lot of character and a lot of background. Is how someone uses language can really tell a lot of the story there. Time for one more question. Anyone? All right. Thank you all for being here. It's been a treat.